The ridiculousness of the left continues in this article written a couple years ago. Another student got so tired of being bullied for his political views in class that he made an audio recording of the teacher, good on him, who repeatedly harangued him about Donald Trump. The recording got into the hands of several parents who confronted school administrators. Good for them. In his words, they had to own up to the consequences of Mr. Trump's election. Upon hearing this recording, it reminded me of the descriptions a friend of mine makes when recalling his classroom experiences. Growing up in communist Hungary in the 1970s. When this recording became public, several parents confronted the principal, and only then was he forced to take action. He wouldn't have done it on his own because, he had no problem with it, right? The Adena Schools District had hired someone to go from elementary school to elementary school, lecturing little children on white privilege. He has spent his last year going from classroom to classroom in the Adena elementary schools, starting kindergarten through 5th grade, teaching about white privilege. They did a 6-week project. The students age 8, had to each pick a black person and do a project on only black people, including drawing pictures of them and writing up reports. What we know as parents is very little. But for every rat you see, there are 50 rats you don't see. I can't imagine what is going on behind closed doors with these impressionable children. And finally, the bus driver. I worked for Adena for almost 13 years driving a school bus. We were forced to attend equity classes that basically were excoriating us for our white privilege. I had some wonderful times driving, but the indoctrination was more than ridiculous. The outpouring of outrage and concern from Adena parents and students following our first post on this subject has been extraordinary, and I'm sure we have barely scratched the surface. Adena is by no means unique. Across the country, student achievement has been sliding as a social justice agenda has replaced rigorous instruction in the priorities of teachers and administrators. This can't be allowed to continue, but it does. So now I want to talk to you about who the players were. Who were the great causes? What were the great causes of our and what caused the philosophies of teachers and education people, instructors to change into the crap that we're being faced with today? In an article by Christopher Dawson, The Tragedy of American Education, the Role of John Dewey, and of course we'll cover John Dewey in more detail, but this, I highlighted some excerpts of here to hit some major points here. Referring to Dewey reminds us, in his views, our purpose for education is not the communication of knowledge, but the sharing of social experience, so the child becomes more integrated into the democratic community. Does that sound like it's educating the kid or turning him into a socially aware lemming? John Dewey, the principal figure in the progressive educational movement in the United States, believed in an educational system that claims that both truth and knowledge are the result of observation and experience. Their ideas on education derive from a philosophy of pragmatism. Following Dewey, the progressive movement propagated that the central ethical imperative was the concept of advocacy of democracy, the one and ultimate ethical ideal of humanity. Does any of this sound like someone learning math and reading? Some critics believed that, and still believe, that under Dewey's educational system, students would fail to acquire basic academic skills and knowledge. No duh. Others were fearful that classroom order and the teacher's authority would disappear. They probably constituted a minority at the time, this being 100 and some years ago, But recent events seem to demonstrate that their concerns cannot be ignored. If society rejects or ignores the existence of an objective moral order and throws into the dustbin of history the concept of natural law, relativism takes its place and becomes the ethical norm of conduct in accordance with man's own personal experience and or observations. If these two factors we add, if to these two factors we add the lack of respect and contempt for authority, we have created the formula for chaos and eventually a totalitarianism of the worst kind. Society cannot survive without order and respect for legitimate authority, both at the government level and primarily at the family level, where children are expected to be taught the difference between right and wrong. Universal education makes for uniformity, has now extended all over the world, and as Dawson reminds us, behind the smoke screen of blue books and handbooks, great forces are at work, which have changed the lives and thoughts of men more effectively than the arbitrary power of dictators and the violence of political revolutions. He continues his analysis of universal state-run education by warning his readers that once the state has accepted full responsibility for the education of the whole youth of the nation, it is obliged to extend its further control, or its control further and further, into new fields, to the physical welfare of its pupils, to their feeding and medical care, to their amusements, and to the use of their spare time, and finally, to their moral welfare and their psychological guidance. This universal education will only serve to create a new Leviathan which embraces the entire field of culture, including all forms of educational institutions, not excluding private nursery schools and universities. Given the disproportionate in wealth between religious and other private institutions and the more powerful modern state, the former ones are prone to face serious financial and academic curricular determination crises in the near future. So, that is a overarching view of the problem with how the liberal education would affect children, has affected children, and we've seen the anecdotal evidence of that. Now, who are these paragons on the left that have created the problems in philosophy in education that we have today? Well, Alex Newman is an author who wrote a series of stories online, and he worked his way. He writes for the Epic Times. Feel free to look it up. And he's written a series of stories based on individuals who have affected our current education system. The first one is about Horace Mann, who we mentioned in our history. Before government took over education in Massachusetts and eventually the rest of the United States, the state and the nation had a thriving education system that produced the best educated population on the planet up until that time. As we mentioned, we were highly literate. But then Horace Mann came along and everything changed. Many of America's founding fathers, like the broader population, received the bulk of their basic education at home. Even poor children could receive a formal education, though largely provided by churches and philanthropists. The Quakers, for example, ran schools that welcomed anyone, whether they could pay or not. And yet, long before government seized control of education, Americans were incredibly well educated. Literacy data and vast amounts of anecdotal evidence from that era show literacy levels were significantly higher in the late to mid 1700s than they are today. Modern studies on the subject confirm that. Most children learn to read at home before ever stepping foot in a formal school, for instance. An ambitious lawyer turned politician turned educator, or educational reformer, with almost no experience as an educator, came on the scene. He had grandiose ideas and messianic delusions that would eventually see the complete restructuring of the entire educational system in the United States. His name, Horace Mann. The origins of government school movement in America began with now obscure communist named Robert Owen and his failed collectivist colony in Indiana known as New Harmony. Owen's early 19th century writings on education inspired the King of Prussia to establish a national government education system based on statist ideals, education by the state, for the state, of, for, and by. Prussia's totalitarian system included mandatory schooling for all children, powerful police forces to deal with noncompliance, segregation of children by age, instilling of status mindset in all children, and more. It was the first system of its kind anywhere on the planet. It would not be the last. The Owen-inspired Prussian system captured the imagination of Horace Mann and his wealthy associates. These mostly Harvard-educated elites were increasingly abandoning the Orthodox Christianity that defined early America in favor of liberal, Unitarian, and secular ideas about man and nature. They had an obsession with reforming man and society in their own image. By the mid-1830s, the educational reformer was ready to advance big government in the United States in an unprecedented manner. The total takeover of education by the state. 1830s, folks. With a governor friendly to their ideas in place, remember I said Boston or Massachusetts was the hub of all reform in education. Mann and his wealthy backers launched their transformative education plan in 1837. This including setting up a state board of education, the first in America, that would oversee education throughout the Commonwealth. Mann was chosen to serve as the board's first secretary, as we mentioned. The keystone of the system envisioned by Mann was a network of government-run seminaries or normal schools that would train all Massachusetts teachers to teach what the state wanted taught. It did not take long for the state-sponsored normal schools to begin indoctrinating future teachers with Mann's naturalistic views on religion, including the introduction of the quack phrenology book, The Constitution of Man. Mann, like Owen before him, only more quietly, rejected the Bible and Orthodox Christianity, putting him far outside the mainstream of 1800s America. Far. The prevailing Calvinist worldview in early America held that man was innately and totally depraved, and so government must be strictly limited in its powers. Depraved men should not be in power with too much power. Men like Owen and Mann, however, believed people were basically good, and that the right set of policies and education would perfect mankind to create utopia. The views of Mann and Owen ultimately prevailed over the traditional understanding of education that had been refined and perfected over the centuries. But while Mann predicted that government schools would ultimately render obsolete 9/10 of the crimes in the penal code, in reality, their proliferation coincided with a downward spiral that would see crime and immorality explode to unprecedented heights. Mann claimed that those engaged in the sacred cause of education were entitled to look upon all parents as having given hostages to our cause. Shortly before his appointment as education secretary, he gushed at the mere thought of having the future minds of such multitudes dependent on in some way, on him. What an arrogant ass. But even in Massachusetts, one of them, just a handful of jurisdictions that had any government involvement in education at all, the free market and Christianity still dominated the educational scene by the early to mid 1800s. Common schools were in steep decline as the overwhelming majority of parents chose to educate their children at home and in vastly superior private schools. At least that was the case until man came along and created America's first ever state-controlled, bureaucratic, property tax-funded government school system. At the same time that was occurring, along with a militant secularization of education, man and his cohorts waged a campaign to demonize the phenomenal private academies across the state, as well as the parents who sent their children there. Until man, across America and the broader Western world, education was regarded as a process of giving children intellectual tools and moral instruction. The primary end was to know God, with developing the intellectual abilities of children a secondary purpose. After man, though, there was a radical transformation. The so-called progressive education, as it came to be known, was the new norm. Under his vision, schools were to serve as tools for reshaping human nature and society to achieve a heaven on earth ideal. One of the most far-reaching innovations to enter schools under man was the whole word method of teaching reading, as opposed to the phonics that had been used for thousands of years. It ended in total disaster, and we will talk about that more soon. Man went to Prussia to gain deeper understanding of that regime's centralized indoctrination system. Upon his return to the United States, he beat back conservative attackers upset about his schemes. Then he traveled the country like an evangelist, shilling for government schools, successfully promoting the Prussian system in state after state. In Prussia, the statist educational system culminated in the total transformation of Germany into one of the most despotic horror shows in human history. Today, it's not working out well for Americans either. Horace Mann, ladies and gentlemen. In part 7, we will talk about our good old friend John Dewey. Be prepared.